settings. Device. Headphones. Say something, please.
Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3.
No.
Onomatopoeia. Me.
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. It's just not coming out of my headphones yet. Oh, now I hear it though. Try it now.
Me. I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle. Here is my spout.
Okay. If there we
Yes,
go.
you are hearing me in your headphones.
Yes, very nice. Very timbrous. I mean, it's just it's a beautiful sound.
Thank you very much.
My lighting is okay, and
Your lighting's okay. Better than most. So,
well, I do this enough. I'll try to move you over here so that I'll tend to look closer to the actual camera now.
yeah. Okay. So, a couple of tips. I don't know if you've used StreamYard before.
It's been a while. I have, but it's been a while.
Okay. So, it's recording on your browser. So, after we conclude the interview, leave the browser open for a couple of minutes so that it can upload to the server.
Okay.
Um, also, just so you know what's coming, we as I mentioned in my note, I want to talk about the prices of breakfast food. I also listened to a couple of your recent podcasts, and I wanted to. I'll probably start with your state of inflation address, which I found amusing. And also I think there's a couple interesting questions that come with it. And then we'll work our way into breakfast.
Okay. I always like to work my way into breakfast. This will be second breakfast for the hobbits among us.
And it's Mike Ashton.
Correct.
Okay. I want to make sure I pronounced it correctly. I'll count us in. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mike Ashton, welcome to Five Things.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. If you were to explain what you do in a couple of words, what would those words be?
The inflation guy. Just give me a couple of words, but I've been in financial markets for a long time and in inflation markets for a couple of decades now. So I run a firm that does kind of everything related to inflation, from consulting to investment management and everything in between.
Inflation markets. Help me understand that term.
Yeah. So I guess, inflation as something you can trade as opposed to a mere just an economic factor is something that in this country really only dates to the late 1990s when Treasury inflation protected securities became tradable. But nowadays it includes things like inflation swaps, and which exist in lots of countries globally, inflation-linked bonds in lots of countries globally. It overlaps a bit into things like real estate and commodities and things like that. But in general, sort of getting access to that economic effect of inflation, so that hopefully what we end up doing is trying to immunize individuals and companies against the pernicious increase in their pricing.
Fascinating. So, I suppose we could spend all day sort of parsing how you would immunize a company from the effects of inflation. I would presume that would include sort of moving your assets into different kind of positions.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I formed this firm, I'd been on Wall Street for a while, and Wall Street's very good at trading plain vanilla inflation, headline inflation. but not many of us have really direct access to headline inflation. And so, I formed this company originally to try to do things like college tuition inflation, or, a company has exposure to wage inflation, for example, uh, in their particular theater. We had one customer who was an industrial laundry, very labor intensive, and a big exposure to them was wages increasing in their high turnover labor force. And so, how do you address that? You can't buy a security that just pays you wage inflation. It would be great if you could. And so how do you replicate that exposure? How do you produce the same kind of payoff so that when wages go up, your hedges perform well also? And it's not a trivial problem.
I want to bring up something I heard of yours. For those who don't know, Mike is, as he said, he's known as the inflation guy. He presented a state of inflation address. Can you explain to us what this is, and how you did it on your podcast?
Sure. So I've had this podcast now for a year and a half, and it started off as kind of a lark, but I'm on a lot of podcasts, and somebody said you should do your own. I said, yeah, like people want to listen to me talk. So I put out this weekly podcast, and it covers everything from how do tips work to the monthly CPI numbers. What does this mean? What do we care about? Where's inflation going? And I just, for this week, I just sort of said, look, it's the State of the Nation. We just had the State of the Nation address, and you hear lots of things, and it tends to be very long. And I said, let me just sum this up and tell everyone what's the state of inflation today. Where did this inflation come from, and kind of what can we do about it? Because it's not the same message that you typically get from policymakers, either at the Fed or in Congress or the administration. And so it turns out to be a pretty short podcast. It's only 5 or 6 minutes long, but I tried to, but it's actually at some level a pretty simple problem, and at least at the macro level.
What are policymakers leaving out about inflation when they discuss it?
I think it's at some level it's very simple. If you want water to boil, you turn up the heat. When you if you put a bag of microwave popcorn into the microwave and you start pouring heat into it, then the kernels start to pop. And that's what happened after when COVID. I think the important part of the state of inflation address was we kind of did this to ourselves. It wasn't COVID that did it. We made certain choices as a consequence of COVID that naturally led to inflation. When you shut down all the productive capacity by sending everybody home, and yet you give everybody the same amount of money to buy the same amount of stuff, which is no one's producing, that's going to produce inflation. There's just nowhere that can go. And so we knew from day one that it wasn't going to be transitory. And so you got a lot of words, transitory, Putin's price hike, all these things to blame somebody else. But at a very simple level, it was Congress and the administration spending like drunken sailors, and the Federal Reserve printing the money so they could spend like drunken sailors. It's really that simple. And so it's important for us to remember that, because, who should we blame? Should we blame Vladimir Putin? I mean, he's not a great guy, but he's not to blame for inflation. COVID isn't to blame for inflation. It's how we responded to it. And we could have responded differently, and we can change what we've done so far, but we're not.
Did we print too much money?
Absolutely. I mean, and it was evident at the time. We increased M2 money supply. So, the Fed buys bonds and increases reserves, but that's not, you don't spend that. You want to see what happens to actual spendable cash. And by dropping money into everybody's accounts during COVID, we just directly increased the money supply in in a huge way. In fact, we increased the money supply so fast that people just couldn't spend enough of it, and so which produced this fall in velocity, which meant that inflation didn't go up as much as you would have thought. The amount of money in the system went up 40%. Prices have only gone up, 15 to 20% overall. So in fact, we've gotten kind of a better result than we should have expected. But if you put 40%, if you produce 40% more of something, its price goes down. If you produce 40% more apples in a year, apples prices are going to go down. In this case, we produce 40% more money. And so the price of money goes down, which means it's worth less, it buys less, and that means prices go up, and that's inflation.
So are we talking the stimulus checks, the child tax credit? Are there what other ways are we handing money out like drunken sailors?
In every way you can imagine. We gave the Paycheck Protection Program, giving money directly to companies to maintain workforces. We sent money directly, stimulus checks directly to individuals. We're trying to forgive student loans. We're trying to forgive this, that, and the other thing. I mean, there's any number of the numbers that add up to the trillions. Those are all many of those are direct injections of cash into the system. Things that we used to think were just crazy. Now, it's not just Congress. You kind of need both sides of this. If you did those things and at the same time you either increased taxes on the other side or you issued a bunch of bonds, then there's some natural offset. So if I pour money into the system, but at the same time I issue a bunch of bonds that people have to use, and that people use the money that I sent them to buy those bonds, and at the end of the day, all I've done is move the money around. But instead, what happens, we issued a bunch of bonds and the Federal Reserve bought those bonds with money that they created electronically. And that part was critical as well. So you had both pieces. You had crazy amounts of spending, which, in the absence of the Fed would just change what things were inflating. And you had the money to do that coming out of thin air. And you put those two things together, and it's just exactly what you would expect. You would expect to get inflation. That's the ages-old recipe for how you get inflation, and that's exactly what we got.
And one of the places where we're seeing a bunch of inflation is with breakfast. I was looking at bacon and eggs and cereal and buying these things for my home, and the prices of all these things have jumped, and the cereal boxes don't look like they did. I've heard of a term called shrinkflation.
Inflation, yes, sure. So we actually, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when they calculate CPI, actually does a pretty good job with shrinkflation and accounting for it. If a box, goes down in size by half, that does show up in CPI. I mean, you could think about the inflation number. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys the price of cereal, they think about it in terms of dollars per ounce. So if you get fewer ounces, then that goes into the CPI. So we actually do a good job of accounting for it. But clearly, one of the reasons that it's happening that way is to delude the consumer into thinking that they're getting more than they really are. A lot of, any particular product you look at has a story. And at the end of the day, a lot of that story ends up going back to we've created way too much money, but they also have idiosyncratic stories. So with eggs, there is something of an idiosyncratic story that there's the avian flu has gone around, and that decreases the number of hens, and that decreases the number of eggs. And that's something that is transitory. At some point, we'll have those chickens back and we'll have more eggs. But that's not the only reason that eggs and breakfast foods are going up in price. I mean, a lot of other things go into the price of breakfast, like packaging, transportation, the people who work at slaughterhouses, all those things go into the price of your breakfast. And so even if we get hens and they start laying eggs a bunch again, then then the price of eggs comes back down. It's not going to go back down to where it was. And so you get lots of volatility. You get prices going up and down and all over the place. And they all have their own little story. But at the end of the day, prices go up, prices go down, and we're going to end up 5 years from now with the price of eggs higher than they were before COVID. It's just kind of permanently.
Okay, let's back up a bit.
I covered a lot there, didn't I?
Yeah, absolutely. How does the price of packaging, how is packaging affecting the price of these products?
Well, when you look at not just packaging, but think about the grocer's overhead, right? So when the grocer goes and stamps up, so the grocer, before you get it, you go to the grocery store and you buy it from the grocer, and the grocer buys it from the dairy or the egg provider, or whatever the product is, and marks it up. And part of the reason they mark it up is because they have their overhead, whether it's heating the grocery store or paying for someone to stock the shelves or work the registers and so on. And so they have a cost, and those costs have gone up. The level before that, the egg producer, has to buy the cartons to go put the eggs in. Well, the cartons are made of polyurethane, and that, by the way, is tied to the cost of energy because it's a byproduct of energy. So those little styrofoam things, are tied to the price of energy. So when energy prices go up, as they have, then that also works into the cost. The egg producer has to buy the styrofoam, and that goes into the price of your eggs. And then, of course, you've got the fact that you have fewer hens are laying fewer eggs, and so you've got all those things that are all going in the same direction. But even when the hens start laying eggs, you still got the fact that styrofoam has gone up, and the people who go around and collect the eggs, those prices have gone up, and the cost of electricity for the the egg farm has gone up, and so on and so forth. So those things stick around.
You mentioned energy prices and you mentioned transportation earlier. I'm assuming those prices are intertwined.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, transportation is obviously energy plays a big part of that, gasoline, but also labor. You have to pay somebody to go drive the truck, and so and actually even the quantity of trucking and or trains and things like that also play into it. So that it's a pretty complex thing. They all kind of play in. During COVID and in the aftermath of COVID, one of the things that happened is we had a shortage of truck drivers. Because we just didn't have as many people out on the roads doing anything, and so there were as many truckers around. I mean, I have a friend. Well, one of the things about being the inflation guy is when you go to a party and you start talking to people, you end up asking all kinds of crazy questions about the weird work that they do. And so, because you want to know, hey, how does trucking actually work? Are you having any problems with trucking right now? You have any problems getting drivers? And so I was told by one friend that I met at a party that, they were having an enormous problem finding drivers, not just that it cost them a lot more. They couldn't even, they were actually having to, other trucking companies that offered better hours or, the ability to be home in the evening and things like that, that were offering other kinds of benefits to draw drivers into the fold. So it was a really big problem for a while where people were actually, big companies, big box companies were actually bidding, we're paying the trucking companies, a premium so that their stuff would get from the docks or from wherever to their stores. That problem has lessened a bit over time, but it's still, it's still there.
So who's passing on the increased price of transportation onto the consumer? Is it the grocery store themselves, or is it the provider of the products?
Yeah. So I mean, how freight gets charged is a different issue, and it's different in different industries, and sometimes the manufacturer pays for it and it's in the price. Sometimes the manufacturer adds that on top as a freight charge. You know, and so sometimes it's paid explicitly or implicitly, but at the end of the day, the person buying the end product somehow is paying for it. Whether it's that the grocer, gets the invoice and the invoice says, 1,000 eggs and then a freight charge on top, or whether those 1,000 eggs were just more expensive this month, and the guy says, hey, it's the freight, it's killing me, is not as material as the fact that somewhere there's a cost of freight, and that ends up in the end product price.
Bread is a
and the grocer can decide. The grocer can decide to eat some of that, not the eggs. They can eat some of the price increase, and say, okay, well, it's costing me 50 cents more for these eggs. I'm only going to charge 40 cents more. And in the old days before COVID, that's one of the reasons inflation kind of stayed low and stable is that grocers, some of that volatility, whether it was a grocer or whatever the end vendor was, would eat some of that volatility. Look, prices go up, prices go down, so I'll make a little bit more when prices are down. I'll make a little bit less when it's up, but I'll try to maintain a stable price for my customer. Over time, when inflation hits and we get into a different mindset, the inflationary mindset, you get much more pass-through pricing. That went up 50 cents for my supplier, it's going 50 cents more to my end customer, period. Because otherwise, I just keep losing and losing my margin. So when we get this kind of environment, you get much more pass-through pricing, and spoiler alert, it's really hard to go back to the old way. Once you start doing pass-through pricing, it's really hard to not do it unless you're really sure that inflation is done.
So you would expect, based on that statement, that we should, as we see, like the whether it's the price of wheat or the price of packaging or transportation rockets up and down, up and down, up and down in a high inflationary environment, that stores would say, hey, like, I'm sorry, but you just got to pay more.
That's right. And you know what else happens? With all that volatility, one of the things that happens is that a store will take advantage of the volatility to add a little bit to its margins. So let's suppose that the price of eggs goes up $1 and back down $1, which isn't really isn't going to happen. But let's suppose it did. The grocer raises it $1 and drops it 90 cents and takes 10 cents more margin. And so, and at the end of the day, somebody comes to them and says, hey, these eggs are, is somebody going to say, are the eggs 10 cents more expensive? No, they'll say it's 90 cents cheaper. And if he does say it's 10 cents more expensive, you say, well, freight's been killing me and, blah, 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 blah. You have all kinds of excuses, and people are accustomed to it. And so, we see that directly in a lot of the companies that I talk to and advise, is they take advantage of the upstream volatility in prices to just grab a little more margin along the way. And it's hard to do, but you sort of feel like you have to, because you have to get ahead of inflation a little bit, and you can sneak it in there, because after all, for the last 25 years, you've seen your margins just gradually getting squeezed. So it's an opportunity to get some of them back.
So you also mentioned that when it's not as inflationary an environment, that they'll absorb some of those costs. But once they start passing on the costs, it's hard for them to stop. Do you have any sense of what kind of conditions it would take for them to absorb more of those shocks? Like, what would have to happen what would have to happen to economically in order to have us have more stable pricing in grocery stores?
It's a behavior that gets learned, and it has to get unlearned. And what happened was, for 25 years, we had low and stable prices. And at the beginning, vendors passed along a lot of the volatility, and they just gradually learned that if they did change prices, they could lose a lot of business. And in fact, when COVID started, some of the people we were advising were, we would say, listen, you need to raise your prices, and they'd say, we can't, we'll lose all of our business. And I'd say, listen, you can lose all your business, you can lose all of your profit. you could choose, but by the way, you might not lose all your business. And so they've raised prices, and what's happened is companies have learned that raising prices doesn't automatically lose all your business. And so what you need to have happen is you would need to have, you need to have a lengthy period of low and stable prices again for companies to gradually unlearn this. If you had truly had a spike in gasoline prices, like we've had in the last 25 years, we've had periodic spikes in prices. They go up, they go down, and everything goes back to normal. If it had happened really quickly, then it could probably be unlearned. But we've had a spike now in prices, and this volatility. It's gone on now for several years, and almost everybody has learned this new lesson. It takes a really long time, because you think what happens if you decide, well, I'm going to hold my prices now and I'm just going to absorb all this volatility. Well, if you're right and the volatility has gone back down, then you're back to square one, and you're back in the old regime. But if you decide to hold your prices and there's still lots of volatility, then you're going to get, and especially if it's volatility in gradually rising prices, then you're just going to see your margins squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and you might have plenty of business, but you're not going to make any money. So you really do need you need a lengthy period that retrains everybody to this low and stable environment. And by the way, you can sort of look back prior to COVID, and you looked at how manufacturers did pricing in the United States compared to, say, some countries in Latin America where inflation is a much more common thing. There was much more pass-through pricing in those economies because they've never learned holding the line on prices, right? So now we've just become more like them.
It also sounds like we, as the public, not responding to these prices, just simply accepting higher grocery bills, has taught the grocers that, hey, we could just pass this on and it'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. I mean, I think that's the whole notion of anchored inflation expectations, and which, by the way, was never a theory till the early 1990s, and the Fed had to explain why it was that suddenly inflation just stopped moving around so much. And so they came up with this idea that everyone just started pushing back on price changes. I'm not sure if I'm a grocer and people push back on the fact that I've raised the price of eggs. I just need to find better excuses. I mean, I can say, okay, fine, I'll lower my price of eggs, and then everyone comes and buys the eggs here. Or I can say, listen, I'm sorry, this is the price, go across the street, and eventually he's going to run out of eggs and you're going to be back over here. So I don't know that consumers really have that much power. Certainly, any small group of consumers doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of power in terms of forcing the vendor to maintain prices. At the end of the day, the vendor's got to make a living too, and so there's not nearly as much discretion on those things. Now, maybe in terms of one-on-one contracts, like if you're talking to your accountant, maybe you've got more bargaining power, right? But if you're talking to your landlord and you say, well, I'm not going to pay that high rent, he says, then I'll see you later because there's somebody else who's going to pay the higher rent. So I'm not really sure that the anchored inflation expectations really had that much power. But having said that, they're clearly not anchored anymore, and people don't really push. So that's something again which has to be relearned. It's funny. One place you see this is in menus in restaurants. So there was a place we went to in my town here in Morristown, New Jersey, a restaurant that hadn't changed its prices in 6 or 7 years. I mean, the prices were permanently printed on the menu. And then COVID happened, and a couple months later, we went in there, and there were these little, once you could go in there again, there were these little sticky notes over all the prices. And And so once you've, and now more and more restaurants have iPads or whatever, so they can change the prices whenever they want. Well, once you start to do that, once you figure out a way that you don't have the what we call menu costs, the cost of reprinting the menu used to be an impediment to going and changing your prices. Well, once you figure out an easy way to go do that, then prices just change a lot more, and you stop noticing all those little changes. We noticed the sticky notes because we'd never seen them before. But if they go to iPads and they change the price of the tuna roll by $1, I might not notice that so much.
Our listeners can't see me nodding vigorously to you as you explain this, because as I go out to restaurants, what I'm seeing more and more where I live in Rochester, New York, we're seeing QR codes everywhere. Yes. And you end up with a menu where it's not printed at all, where it could be updated at any moment. And places where there used to be printed menus, they're printed, sure, but there's no prices on them.
Right. Yeah. Yes, exactly. No, and that all started originally, because of we wanted no contact, right? So we don't want to hand out these menus because they might get COVID on them. And along the way, restaurateurs went, this actually has a little side benefit to it. We can change prices very easily this way, and people don't notice.
Well, I wanted to touch on a couple other food items and wanted to see if there were actual what elements are going on in with bread, because those prices have also risen. I've read that the Ukraine war plays a role in that. I don't know how big it would be for U.S. customers. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, look, Ukraine, we've learned a lot about Ukraine that we maybe didn't know unless you were a geography expert prior to the Ukraine war. But Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. And, they produce lots and lots of grain. Actually, they're throughout the war, they've actually produced more than I kind of thought they would. I kind of thought they would produce zero. And so they've kind of continued to produce it. But to the extent they don't produce as much as they did, that creates demand elsewhere. So it creates demand from, U.S. Farmers, right? And so that's part of it. But there's also another factor beyond that, beyond the Ukraine war, I guess still related to it, and that the rise in natural gas prices. Natural gas is an important input into fertilizer. And so we actually have a global fertilizer shortage right now because a lot of the natural gas came from Russia, and we don't have as much of that. And natural gas prices in Europe are crazy, and that's where a lot of the fertilizer manufacturers were. And so all that comes back into how much grain can we actually produce. We produce less, and therefore the price of bread goes up. So, and some of those things, look, the price of fertilizer, fixing that is a multi-year problem, especially if we never sort of restore relationships with Russia again. And so that source of natural gas is permanently cut off to us, and the price of fertilizer is going to be permanently higher, which again goes into the cost of all these things that we grow. But yeah, so I think both of those things were related to, again, grain prices go up and down for all kinds of reasons, but there was a very large spike associated with the Ukraine war for both of those reasons. In the short term, because Ukraine was producing less and exporting less, and in the longer term, because it affects fertilizer prices. So going forward, productivity and output of grains is lower.
Are there other factors with the price of bread, or is that the primary one?
Well, I think that's sort of the main ones, but a lot of the same factors as with eggs. Again, transportation, packaging, all those things go into everything that you buy. You sort of have to, when you look at sort of inflation, you think about food and energy. We take out food and energy. We look at core inflation. Those things are actually very different. So energy, the way we purchase most of our energy in the form of gasoline, is very much the commodity, right? I mean, there is transportation, but in terms of the value of what they transport, most of the variation in the cost of gasoline is the price of gasoline on international markets. Food is much less that way. There's much more that goes into it, much more in processing that happens. You don't process gasoline. I mean, you crack out the crude and then you don't process it a whole heck of a lot after that. Whereas with food, there's lots of steps of the process, and in each of those steps, there's additional costs on there. And so what that really means is that increases in the price of food, like we've seen across lots of different sorts of foodstuffs, tends to be stickier when it happens.
I'm a big fan of pork with my breakfast, whether it's bacon or it's sausage. Those prices have also risen. Are there pressures in addition to packaging and transportation on those markets as well?
Yeah, although that's I think recently the upward pressure has sort of abated, and hog prices have started to come down. But there was swine flu, so we have avian flu affecting eggs. We got swine, and chicken, and we got swine flu affecting uh, pork. And you had the bunch of slaughterhouses were shut down for beef. So there's been lots of, and again, that's back to those idiosyncratic factors that really did just sort of hit us all at once. I mean, it seems like every major foodstuff had some story associated with it, and in a weird, almost kind of a weird conspiracy theory kind of way. I mean, it did seem like everything was being affected. It does seem like the effect on pork is lessening a little bit, and actually one of the sort of the long run benefits on the pork side is that as various emerging markets become wealthier, they tend to move up the meat chain, so they tend to consume more beef and less pork. And so, to the extent that we are the rest of the world's getting a little wealthier over time, they'll move away from pork, and your bacon might get a little cheaper, or at least not go up in price as much. So that's my hopeful note for you today.
It seems it seems like a comedy of errors with our food supply
Yeah.
right now. Like everything that could go wrong is going wrong.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And again, a lot of those things really are transitory, and eventually we'll have more hens, we'll have more eggs, and the swine flu is faded, and a lot of those things. But at the end of the day, again, 5 years from now, food prices compared to prior to COVID, they're still going to be higher. And that's something which was not true prior to COVID. The prices went up and down, and the prices of foodstuffs, they gradually went up over a long period of time, but they didn't, you barely noticed. When we're done here and you look back and you look at pre-COVID prices and post-COVID prices, the prices of all these things is going to be higher because transportation is going to be permanently more expensive. The labor is going to be more expensive, and all the packaging is going to be permanently more expensive. All those things are going to end up costing more, and those things will stick around. So, but from what we have seen, we're probably likely to see some retracement at some point. Is it going to happen next month or two? Probably not. Later this year, possibly. By next year, pretty sure.
I want to ask you about one more piece of breakfast. Many people start their day with coffee.
Amen.
What's going on with coffee prices?
There's an awful lot of coffee in Brazil. Um, we've actually gotten a little bit lucky with coffee in that, the dollar being, so very strong. We don't grow coffee, right? We import it, and so when the dollar is very strong, it does help us with imports of coffee. The bad news is that the dollar is probably not going to continue. There are a lot of people who think the dollar is going to be weaker a year from now than it is now, which probably means an upward, thrust on the price of coffee. But again, you've got, wages the world over are going up, and you have to harvest the coffee. You've got to ship the coffee. Same kind of factors going into a lot of those things. But in the case of coffee, especially because we do so much import of it and we don't grow as much of it, we don't grow any of it here. It really does have a lot of sensitivity to, how the dollar is behaving in world market. So that's not great news.
Yeah, it's not.
Sorry. Sorry, but you'll get your bacon a little bit cheaper, but you're going to have to pay more for your coffee.
Mike Ashton, any famous last words?
I will say this I think is the first podcast I have ever been on where we, people were asking about my baking advice. But I will say I did discover, some years ago when I ran out of eggs when I was making pancakes, that there are a surprising number of substitutes for eggs. For example, in making pancakes, I discovered applesauce. So we use eggs for two things. One is moisture, and the other is for as a binding agent. And it turns out that applesauce does both things pretty well. So, to the extent that some of those breakfast foods are a little more expensive, especially eggs as you use them in baking and so on, there are a surprising number of substitutes. And if you like baking, it's kind of fun to go and find those things. But like I say, I have not previously been asked for my baking advice. Maybe it's a different podcast.
I will try some applesauce sandwiches.
Might be maybe in a pita.
Yes. Mike Ashton, thank you for joining me.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. I enjoyed it.
Me too.